Lermai as Felcheru. Good day and welcome. My name is Andrew Langer-Newton, and this is my channel on the legal and constitutional history of the Isle of Man. Today, I'm on the outskirts of Castletown at Hango Hill, a place name derived from the Old Norse for Gallows Hill. It was the site in 1663 of the execution of William Doane, Brown William Christian, known in some quarters as the Manx Martyr. The site is identified today by the remains of a 17th century summer house built by the Earls of Derby, known as Mount Strange. However, it's not the life, trial and execution of William Doane that I'm going to discuss in this video. Rather, it'll look in a different direction, towards King William's College. King William's College has been a fundamentally important institution for learning in the Isle of Man for nearly 200 years, providing the formative education for MHKs, Deemsters, captains of industry, and, in the last 40 years, chief ministers of the Isle of Man government. It was founded in the 1830s by the Bishop Barrow Trust on land that was formerly Hango Hill Farm. At the time of its founding in the 1830s, the Bishop Barrow Trust was nearly 170 years old, being founded in the 1660s by Bishop Barrow for the benevolent education of young men in the Isle of Man. Bishop Barrow had come to the Isle of Man at the end of Cromwell's Commonwealth and the restoration of the monarchy in England, to be Bishop of Soda and Man, and in the absence of the Governor of Man, in the absence of the Lord of Man, Governor of the Isle of Man. As to how Bishop Barrow obtained the farm at Hango Hill and settled it into trust, the story has to go back further in time. The land at Hango Hill Farm stretched from King William's College over in this direction up towards the modern day airport at Ronaldsway. And there's some evidence that the farmhouse of Hango Hill Farm might have been on this coastline, which abuts onto the important strategic harbour at Derby Haven, synonymous with the English kings of the Isle of Man and then lords of the Isle of Man. Now, the story starts with the sale of Hango Hill Farm in the early 1620s from the Norris family, with the patriarch Thomas Norris, to the Lace family with the patriarch John Lace. And you would think this would be a happy occasion for the Lace family, taking ownership of this important, valuable farmland. But on reflection, it was the trigger or the signal for the start of 100 years, a century of trials, tribulations and Pyrrhic victories for the Lace family, unfortunately. Now, things started to go sour almost immediately for the Lace family when, in the late 1620s, the son of Thomas Norris, who had sold the land to John Lace, he brought a claim in the Abbey Court for recovery of Hango Hill Farm. This case was decided in favour of the Lace family, victory number one, deciding that the sale of the land in the early 1620s had been a good sale, a proper sale, and that claim failed against the recovery of the land for the Norrises. However, very, very shortly afterwards, in the early 1630s, the father-in-law of Thomas Norris, who had originally sold the land to John Lace, a man called Thomas Ireland, he brought a claim in the Deemster's Court for recovery of the land on the basis that he had originally funded the purchase by the Norris family of Hango Hill Farm, or part of the purchase monies. That case was heard by Deemster Stanley, guided by the House of Keys, acting in its judicial capacity at that time, guiding the Deemster on Isle of Man law. and it was decided emphatically in favour of the Lace family. The sale in the early 1620s again had been confirmed as valid, and they were the owners of the Hango Hill Farm. Unfortunately, despite two judgments in favour of the Lace family, the seneschal, after the second case and the confirmation by the House of Keys, the seneschal of the Isle of Man, a person you might say in an executive or governmental position, assisting the Lord of Man, installed Thomas Ireland, the father-in-law of the original seller, Thomas Norris, into Hango Hill Farm, despite the Lace family having had their ownership confirmed twice. This meant that the Lace family had to bring a third case that was again decided by the House of Keys and again decided in their favour. So by the end of the 1640s, you finally get the Lace family having the land returned to them, but unfortunately not the end of the saga for the Lace family. In the early 1650s, the comptroller of the Abbey lands, a man named John Sharples, held a very clandestine court, you might say a Star Chamber style court, where he decided, notwithstanding two House of Keys judgments in favour of the Lace family, that it was actually the Norris family who owned the land, and they had the power, the vires, to grant him, John Sharples, the comptroller of the Abbey lands, the lease of the land. In a very unusual scenario, but unfortunately that meant the Laces are again then turfed out of the land at Hango Hill Farm. But by then, the son of the original John Lace, or John Lace Jr., he brings another claim for recovery of the land at the end of the 1650s, early 1660s, so the end of Cromwell's Commonwealth and the restoration of the monarchy in England. At that time, a time of significant change throughout the British and Irish Isles and in the Isle of Man, and seeing some hope in those changes, brings another case, again heard by the House of Keys for the third time, and the House of Keys again confirmed the original judgments, confirming that the Lace family are the true owners of Hango Hill Farm. So this appears to be great news. The end of the Commonwealth, restoration of the monarchy, and the return of Hango Hill Farm to the Lace family. However, it's not the end of the saga. Enter Bishop Barrow. Bishop Barrow came to the Isle of Man in the 1660s after the restoration of the monarchy in England and the end of the Civil War. Finding the Isle of Man population, in his words, as rude and barbarous, he set his sights on advancing society in the Isle of Man through education and edification. He conceived of the idea of the Bishop Barrow Trust to fund the education of young men in the Isle of Man. For this altruistic endeavour, he set his sights on the rich and fertile and valuable land at Hango Hill Farm. He held a court in 1667 at Castle Rushen, where he was not only the claimant, but also the beneficiary and the judge, a very clandestine assembly. It's not apparent that John Lace Jr., owner of Hango Hill Farm, which had been confirmed 3 times by the House of Keys, was aware of this court, because he didn't apparently appear there to make submissions on his behalf. The court decided that the land at Hango Hill Farm was granted to Bishop Barrow, and he sent soldiers to evict the Laces from Hango Hill Farm. At the time, John Lace Jr. was away from the farm, and his wife and young child were taken to Castle Rushen and imprisoned by the soldiers. John Lace Jr. returning to the farm and finding the eviction of his wife and child, was imprisoned at Peel Castle. Against his imprisonment and the expropriation by Bishop Barrow of Hango Hill Farm, he brought a claim that was heard very promptly in December 1667 by the House of Keys. The House of Keys, hearing the matter of the ownership of Hango Hill Farm for the fourth time, decided emphatically in favour again of the Lace ownership, confirming the previous judgments and saying that if Bishop Barrow wanted the land at Hango Hill Farm, the Laces needed to be properly compensated, not only for the imprisonment but and the expropriation of the land. Bishop Barrow, unhappy with this, appealed to the Lord of Man in England. The Lord of Man acted aggrieved by the House of Keys' decision, acted with further and some ferocity by summoning yes men, later described as yes men of the House of Keys, to England, and demanded they reverse their decision. Under this extreme weight of autocratic authority, the House of Keys had to relent. What Reverend Canon Stenning later called as the most obvious and apparent example of force majeure state authority over the House of Keys in Isle of Man history. Under this extreme weight, the House of Keys had to relent and had to ultimately grant the land in favour of Bishop Barrow, which was then settled in the Bishop Barrow Trust. This is not the final end of the story, however. John Lace Jr.'s son brought a later claim at the end of the 1600s for return of the land. The case was granted in his favour, but the trustees of the Bishop Barrow Trust, now the owners of the land at Hango Hill Farm, appealed the case. And on appeal, they succeeded in the early 1700s with a very dubious limitation point in their favour. The case could have been appealed further to the Privy Council in London. However, this was the end of the saga for the Laces. Unfortunately, there was no more money to fund such an appeal, and they had to accept the outcome that the land at Hango Hill Farm was lost forever. If you'd like to learn more about these videos, or more similar videos to this, follow this channel and look out for my next video on sources of Isle of Man law.